Connie tried sneaking out the side door of her office, but it didn't work. Members of her own staff, along with a dozen White House pages, were milling around in the hallway, and they pounced on her the moment she came through the door. Each one of them had a notepad full of urgent questions. All morning, the phones had been as hot as tea kettles, ringing off their hooks with one heavy hitter after another. Senators, foreign ambassadors, queens and kings, Whitmore's family, network anchors, prominent businessmen that would normally be put straight through the president. Nobody knew what to tell these people, each one calling with some crisis on their hands. Connie knew her people needed answers, but didn't have the time to talk to them. She was already 5 minutes late for the presidential briefing, something that had never happened before. She'd been on the job long enough to know the best way to handle a stressful situation. Wear a charming smile, ignore everyone, and bull your way through the crowd. Fran Jeffries, her chief lieutenant, saw what she was going to do. She stepped right in front of her boss and spoke fast.
CNN says they're going to run a piece that the United States may have conducted an open atmosphere nuclear test at the top of the hour unless you call to deny.
Connie shrugged.
Tell them to run with it if they want to embarrass themselves.
Everyone started shouting their questions at her. NASA's been up my butt all morning, a harried aide complained. Can you read their position statement? It's short and they need approval.
Our official position, she told him, is that we don't have an official position.
Constance, still smiling, pushed through, focusing on the portrait of Thomas Jefferson at the end of the hallway. When she got there, she surprised him by turning left, away from the stairs, where more people with more questions were waiting. She pushed a button for the old elevator, a clunky antique installed for Franklin Roosevelt. When Gil Roeder, a top operative, saw she was about to escape, he yelled over the others. Connie, what the hell is going on? Perfect timing. Just as the doors were sliding closed, she tried to look as if her feelings were hurt by the question.
Come on, people. If I knew anything, would I keep you out of the loop?
Outside the doors, she could hear them answering in unison. Definitely. In the Oval Office, the president had already called the meeting to order. He sat with his chief of staff, Glenn Parnas, the head of Joint Chiefs, General Gray, and the Secretary of Defense, Albert Nimzicki. For very different reasons, Whitmore trusted each of them. But I want to remind everyone, Gray was in the middle of saying, that our satellites are unreliable at the moment. It's not clear whether this thing wants to or will be able to enter the Earth's atmosphere. It's still possible it won't come any closer. It might not want to deal with the force of our gravity, for example. That's true, Mr. President, Nimzicki allowed. This object might, as the commander suggests, pass us by. But our responsibility is to prepare for the worst-case scenario. Having no information, we must assume the object is hostile. My strong recommendation is that you retarget several of our ICBMs and launch a preemptive strike. Nimzicki was a tall, gaunt man of 60 who had earned the nickname, the Iron Sphincter. He was a rarity in Washington, a cabinet-level appointee who kept his job through changes of administration. Whitmore was his fourth president, his second Democrat. He was not a likable man, but when he spoke, everyone felt obliged to listen. Some years back, the Post had written about him. Not since J. Edgar Hoover has a government official amassed so much power without ever having stood for election. An intensely political animal, Nimzicki always managed the appearance of staying above politics. He never let them see him pull the strings. He was, in a word, Machiavellian. His suggestion was precisely the kind of shoot first, ask questions later style of thinking everyone else in the room was trying to avoid. Forgive me, Gray broke in, but with the little information we do have, firing on them might be a grave error. If we're unsuccessful, we could provoke them, or it. If we're successful, we turn one dangerous falling object into many. I agree with Secretary Nimziki about retargeting the missiles and getting them set, but Constance came in the door, but stopped short when she saw all the brass. What's the damage? Whitmore asked her, beckoning her to join the discussion. How are people reacting? Hello, gentlemen. She nodded around the table as she took the seat next to Nimziki. The press is making up their own stories at this point. CNN's threatening to plug in a segment suggesting we're covering up a nuclear test. I've scheduled myself a question and answer session for 6 o'clock, which should keep them on ice until then. The good news is nobody's panicking. Not seriously. Nimziki, impatient with the interruption, spoke across the table to Gray. Will, I think it's time for you to contact the Atlantic Command and upgrade the situation to DEFCON 3. The others jumped on him at once, telling him that was premature. The majority opinion was that sounding an alarm and causing a panic before they even knew what they were up against would be a mistake. Nimziki defended his position, but was eventually talked down. At the end of the flare-up, the Chief of Staff, Parnas, was still talking. Furthermore, we're 2 days out from the 4th of July, and 50% of our forces are on weekend leave. Not to mention all the commanders in Washington for the parade on Sunday. The only quick way to call our personnel back to their bases would be to use television and radio. Exactly, Constance seconded. We'd be sending up a major red flag to the world. The door opened again. One of General Gray's men, his liaison to the Pentagon, came in carrying a bombshell. Our latest intelligence tells us that the object has settled into a stationary orbit which keeps it out of direct sight behind the moon. Sounds like it's trying to hide, Gray remarked. That sounds like good news for the time being, Parnas said hopefully. Maybe it just wants to observe us. Gray's liaison wasn't finished. Excuse me, but there's more. The object established its orbit at 10:53 a.m. local time. At 11:01 a.m. local time, pieces of the object began to separate off from the main body. Pieces? Whitmore asked, not liking the sound of it. Yes, sir, pieces, the man continued. We estimate there are 36 of them, roughly saucer-shaped and small compared to the primary object. Still, each craft is approximately 15 miles in diameter. Are they headed toward Earth? Whitmore asked, already knowing what the answer would be. Looks like it, sir. If they continue along their current trajectories, Space Command estimates they'll begin entering our atmosphere within the next 25 minutes. The president stared back at the young man in the Air Force uniform, dumbfounded and more than a little frightened. For a moment, he thought this must be some kind of a joke everyone else was in on. An elaborate piece of theater staged to get a reaction from him this very moment. Then the grim reality of the situation began to sink in. What had seemed so laughable, so far-fetched a few hours before, was coming horribly true. One of the primal fears of mankind, a fear buried under mountains of denial, was coming to pass. The Earth was being visited, and perhaps invaded, by something from another world. Nimziki broke the stunned silence. 36 ships, possible enemies, are headed this way, Mr. President. Whether we like it or not, we must go to DEFCON 3. Even if it causes a panic, we must recall our troops and put them on yellow alert immediately. No one in the room could disagree. An alarm went off, a red light flashing in time with a piercing beep. A door opened and the alarm died. David's arm reached through the door and pulled out his cupo noodles. It was lunch hour at Compact Cable. David had hardly left the feed room. As if there wasn't enough equipment in there already, he had gone and retrieved 2 additional suitcase-sized machines and his laptop computer. They were set upright in the middle of the floor. David was sloppy when he was concentrating. He sat with his feet under him in the chair, elbows between his knees, coiled in concentration. He stared intently at the screen of his laptop computer, watching a visual display that repeated itself about every 20 seconds. Hello, you handsome genius. Marty peeked around the corner, all smiles. I'm not here to pressure you. I'm just checking to see if there's anything you need. Which was, of course, a bold-faced lie. Whenever there was a problem, a mother hen like Marty had to be there. Marty, old pal, have a seat, relax. Marty tiptoed in like a leopard trying not to scratch. David had already kicked him out once for looking over his shoulder and asking too many questions. He had promised himself that he wasn't going to bug David, and for the first 10 seconds, he didn't. Then his willpower broke down. David, tell me you're getting somewhere. I'm begging. Say you've got it figured out. Well, David said very leisurely, I've got good news and bad news. Which would you like to hear first? What's the bad news? The bad news is you're in meal penalty for disturbing my lunch. Marty put a hand on his hip and got sarcastic. Don't tell me. The good news is you're not going to charge me. Actually, David took a last spoonful of soup. The good news is I found the problem. Marty clutched his heart and took a few deep breaths, hamming it up. Thank God. Okay, so what exactly is the problem? There's a weird signal embedded in the satellite feed, a signal within a signal. I have absolutely no idea where it's coming from. Never seen anything like it. Somehow, this signal is being cycled through every satellite in the sky. Marty stared back at him, mouth agape. And exactly why is that supposed to be good news? Because the signal is following an exact sequence, a pattern. So the rest is simple. We just generate a digital map of the signal frequency, then translate it into a binary strand and apply a phased reverse signal with the calculated spectrometer I built for you for your birthday. And bingo, we should be able to block out the overlay completely. Block out the overlay? Marty looked confused. Does that mean we get our picture back? You're quick. Does that also mean, Marty asked slyly, that we'll be the only guys in town who are putting out a clean program? Unless we share what we have learned, David suggested angelically. He knew Marty was hyper-competitive with his fellow station managers and would luxuriate, wallow, and bask in this moment of triumph over them. Ha ha, I love it, Marty erupted with savage glee. Our secret weapon, the phase reverse spectrometer calculation analyzer thingy. This is turning out to be a wonderful day. When Miguel finally found him, Russell had sprayed about a quarter of a 1,000 square yard tomato field. A group of field hands was gathered around their cars, unable to work while the spraying was going on. The field was about a mile long and bordered on one side by a row of giant eucalyptus trees that ran right up the road. Instead of spraying parallel to the trees, Russell was flying straight down the rows and pulled up at the last possible moment, straining the old Liberty engine to clear the tops of the trees. Miguel couldn't tell if he was drunk or crazy, but if this was like most mornings, Russell was both. The plane was a gorgeous old de Havilland bi-wing, a bright red two-seater built the same year Lindbergh crossed the Atlantic. The retractable wings were made of cloth stretched over tight wooden frames. The U.S. Post Office had used de Havillands to open transcontinental airmail service in the 20s. The machine belonged in a Saturday air show, not out dusting crops. It was too heavy and hard to maneuver to begin with, but to make matters worse, Russell had an extra 200 pounds of spray equipment strapped to the back with twine and bungee cords. As Russell dove over the tops of the trees to begin another pass at the tomatoes, Miguel yelled and waved, calling for him to land. The farm workers understood what the boy was doing, and a few of them joined in. The plane's pilot waved back stupidly. "Come on, Russell, wake up," Miguel pleaded. Over the last 2 years, Russell had been going downhill fast. He was drinking himself to death and losing all sense of responsibility for his kids. He'd straightened up for a while when the neighbors had reported him to the police, who in turn had called in the social workers. He'd always been crazy, but when Miguel's mother got sick and finally died, Russell had plunged totally over the edge. He'd developed a death wish. Every few days he'd snap out of it and promise to make a new start, which meant that Miguel was usually the one left to take care of things like paying the rent, getting Troy's medicine, and buying the groceries. That was one thing nobody could take away from Miguel. He was responsible. Russell was less like a parent to him than a burdensome roommate. As the plane circled around for another pass, Miguel suddenly started up his motorcycle and tore straight across the field, uprooting plants and splattering tomatoes as he bounced over the irrigation ridges. He stopped right in the path of the plane, which raced toward him, a white cloud of liquid poison misting out the back. Luckily, Russell saw him in time and shut off the feeder. As he passed, he focused his eyes and saw that the boy was waving him down. He turned around in his seat and smiled to Miguel, raising his thumb to show he understood. He could see the boy was pointing, trying to tell him something, but he didn't understand until he turned back around in his chair and found himself face to face with a picket fence-lined row of 100-foot-tall eucalyptus trees, and it was way too late to pull up. "Whoa, Lordy!" he screamed over the sound of the motor. Luckily for Russell, there was no time to think. Acting purely on reflex, he rolled the plane 90 degrees onto its side and sliced through a narrow gap between the trees. He had less than a foot clearance on either side. Rather than kicking himself for being so stupid or thanking heaven for being so lucky, Russell let out a long, blood-curdling victory whoop, delighted with his own skills. A few minutes later, the plane coasted to a stop on the remote highway. When Miguel raced up and skidded to a halt, Russell was just climbing awkwardly out of the cockpit. "Did you see that?" he yelled. "That was a damn trip." He pulled off his leather aviator's cap and lowered himself carefully onto the lower wing. At 51, Russell Case looked like a big little boy. He had full, round cheeks and a bush of curly blondish hair. He was large, over 6 feet tall, and broad across the shoulders. Over the last couple of years, his drinking had turned his complexion from rosy to ruddy, and he'd started to develop a gut. "What the hell are you doing over here?" Although there was a sharp tone to Miguel's voice, it didn't penetrate his stepfather's thick skin. "I'm bringing home the bacon," Russell sang proudly. "Earning my keep, and if I do say so myself, doing a pretty fine job of it." "This isn't the Foster's place. It's the wrong field," Miguel told him. "You're supposed to be on the other side of town." Russell, still perched on the plane's wing, took a long look at the field and the farmhouse down the road. "Are you sure?" "Damn it, Russell! He was doing you a favor. He was just at the trailer asking where the hell you were. And he's going to make you pay for the spray you wasted." Russell climbed down to the pavement and stood there, a little wobbly, shaking his head. "No use in getting upset about it now," he told himself. But this was the first work he'd had all season, and Lucas was about the only farmer in town who was on his side. He looked at his son, but couldn't think of anything to say. "Do you know how hard it is to find someone who doesn't think you're totally crazy?" the boy hissed. "Now what are we supposed to do? Where are we supposed to go now?" Russell didn't have any answers. He badly wanted to promise Miguel things were going to start changing right then and there. But he knew the boy wouldn't believe him, and he wouldn't have believed himself. So he stood mutely in the center of the road until Miguel kick-started the bike and drove away in disgust. Russell brought out a flask of Jack Daniels out of his pocket. He was pretty sure something had just ended. Maybe it was just the end of him pretending to put up a fight. The last few years had broken him. His wife's degenerative illness and eventual death. The night he was abducted. The news that Troy had inherited his mother's adrenal cortex deficiency. Screw it. If life was going to be that painful, he didn't want any piece of it. If it weren't for his kids, he would have climbed back into the old plane, flown it to its top altitude, then cut the engine and let her free fall back to Earth. Instead, he uncapped the flask and took a long swig of whiskey. Deep in the desert of northern Iraq, Ibn as-Sid Jamal squatted before a small campfire, preparing his morning coffee. A Bedouin, he'd been forced off the land his tribe had claimed as their own for countless generations and had been herded into a squalid, crowded tent city along with several other Bedouin clans. It was still an hour before the first light of dawn, but by force of habit, the whole makeshift village was stirring to life. He reached into the fire and retrieved his grandfather's coffee jar, boiling a thick brew of Arabian coffee. As he was waiting for the grounds to settle to the bottom, he heard a single scream pierce the night air. A second later, many people were screaming and calling out in panic. Jamal stood paralyzed from the sounds. At the top of the dunes, he saw the outlines of a dozen figures rushing toward him. His first thought was that the camp was being attacked by the army, but as the people came sprinting past him, shouting and whimpering, he saw what they were running from. "Inshallah," he muttered to himself. He saw something that knocked his knees out from under him. A giant piece of the sky was on fire. A mountain-sized fireball, flaring orange, white, and gray, was plunging through the sky like a flat rock splashing into a river. The fire cast a dark, reddish glow on the sand as it sank deeper in the sky. Jamal stared up at the phenomenon for several moments as a pounding terror grew in his heart. Finally, he got back to his feet, stammered something unintelligible, then turned to run, screaming just like the others.